As part of the Holland Park Transformation Project, we are conducting a series of interviews of people who attended the West Ward School that used to be located in the center of the block where the park is located. And today, we will continue with Mr. Wilson. So would you begin by giving us your full name and telling us when you went to West Ward?
My given name is Woodrow Wilson Jr., but everyone calls me Woody. I'm thinking I started West Ward in 1950.
And you went for 3 years until it closed?
Went till it closed, yes.
Okay. Did you have brothers, sisters that also went?
I had an older sister that went, she was a couple years older than me.
Okay.
And then I had an eager young brother that followed us to school one day when he was 4 years old, and Miss Biggs had to take him back home.
Okay. When you went to school, I assume you walked.
Yes.
Did you, were you with your sister or neighborhood friends or by yourself?
A combination of both. Early on when I went, I followed my sister, and then it was the neighborhood kids from the Culver Street, Gale Street area,
Yeah.
Gaston Court area.
Okay. Thinking back, and you can pick any grade you want to pick, talk me through a routine day at school for you.
Gosh. Well, in kindergarten, for all the time I was there, I had Miss Biggs. She was the only teacher. And I can remember us going in the morning early in kindergarten and going through the day's school activities. Of course, typical kindergarten, we had the rug where we, at a certain period of time, when we came back in from recess, we lay on the rug for anywhere, I guess, from 15 minutes to a half hour. The typical day was pretty much probably the Pledge of Allegiance, and then we did the various activities, what we're going to do that day, whether it was, most of what I can remember is the alphabet and the numbers, and Miss Biggs was kind of a stickler for following protocol, and she wanted you to toe the line pretty much. If you didn't, she would let you know about it.
How did she do that?
Well, she had two ways. And one of the things when you talk about Miss Biggs, she had a ruler. And if you were misbehaving, you'd stick out your hand, and she would kind of smack you on the hand. One of the other methods was putting you behind the piano in the room that she would play when we had song time. Seemed like there were some periods where some very mischievous little boys and little girls, got put, under the piano by her stool.
Now, you attended what other elementary?
Dalrymple.
Okay. What was that move like for you?
In terms of the physical move, it wasn't that difficult. I think the thing that was challenging is that when they did close Dalrymple, they had a rule that the kids in the Gaston Court, Culver Street, and Gale Street area were required to go to Austin School. But my younger brother Carl, he in essence got to go right to Dalrymple, but they told my old sister Barbara and I that we'd have to go to Austin And my mother said, absolutely not. That's when I knew about some activism early. She said that all my kids would go to school, to the same school. So as a result of that, a number of us from Gaston Court, Culver Street, were held out of school by our parents for a number of weeks and did not go to Austin. It was another form of a boycott. And after we were out maybe a week, two, then we, in essence, were allowed to go to Dalrymple, whereas the other kids whose parents didn't go through with the boycott, they had went to Austin and they wanted a change. They said, absolutely not. You know, you continue to go to, they want to come to Dalrymple, but they said you would continue to go to Austin. And then the next year they got to switch. Going to Dalrymple wasn't that difficult because we knew a lot of the kids because they were from the area and that side of town. I think, if I remember correctly, Miss Weiss was my first teacher, and she was a lot less stringent than Miss Biggs. And being elementary school kids, when you tend to find out you can get away with something, you tend to stretch the limit. Yeah. And that was the biggest change, stretching the limit and knowing that there would be little no repercussions, whereas Miss Biggs would kind of toe the line.
Okay, so you had Miss Biggs for kindergarten and first grade?
Yeah.
And
Miss Weiss is second grade.
Okay, so you had moved for second grade?
Yes.
Okay. Then I'll still ask you some of the same questions, even though you were very young at the time. Do you remember any activities in school that stand out for you more than others? Or, for example, do you remember celebrating like Halloween or Thanksgiving or any classroom stuff with Miss Biggs around that or some other?
She always had activities for us, and then we always had a visiting person that came in and did art.
Okay, do you remember who that was?
I have no idea who that was. That was a person that came every so often, and we would have art in the classroom.
Okay.
But she always, Miss Biggs always stressed the holidays, and she taught us that we needed to be the best students we could be, although a number of us did not listen at that time.
Yeah. Okay, so in addition to Miss Biggs, did you, what impressions did you have of some of the other staff, either the other teachers, or did you know who the janitor was?
I can't remember who the janitor was, but I remember Miss Holmes and Miss Stewart because they lived right up the street on the corner. They lived right across the street from school, on the corner of Austin, and, Albion and Cass Street.
Yeah.
And I always thought they were nice. You know, it was nice to have ladies as administrators and as the other classroom teachers. And I always thought a lot of them, matter of fact, when they left, if I remember, they went to Detroit.
Miss Stewart did.
Miss Stewart? Okay. I remember them going to Detroit, and in the community, I know that my mother and them felt kind of a loss because those folks were good people to look up to.
Do you remember having a substitute teacher ever?
Yes, and throughout my elementary school period, substitute teachers always played that. They didn't really hold the line, so we had substitutes, and then we would occasionally, we had students from Albion College that came in and did our student teaching at West Warren.
Okay. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you recall any other contact with the college, like being taken up there for like a party or any kind of special activity?
Not really when I was at West Ward. When I was at Dalrymple, that happened around Christmas time. Some of the fraternities would come to the elementary school, and I don't know how they selected us,
Yeah.
but we went up to the college and have a Christmas party.
Okay. Now, your father, did he work at the Malibu or Gale or?
He was initially at the Malibu, and then he worked at Ideal Castings.
Okay. Okay. Did you have any contact with like Miss Biggs or Miss Holmes or any of them outside of school?
Well, one of the things that stuck in my mind is that for some reason, one day, Miss Biggs did something that was, at that time, was extremely extraordinary. She took myself, Daniel Bogan, I think Celeste Bell, Marion Wheeler, and Lorena Gamble to her house for lunch. We provided our own lunch. And I can't remember exactly what the purpose was. My thinking is that she probably saw something in us that we weren't maybe the typical student. And she was probably trying to highlight some leadership skills or something, because that was very unusual for that time period.
Yeah. At school, activities like recess at West Ward, do you remember that?
Oh, love recess. Recess was the highlight of the day. You know, they had the swings out in front by the trees.
Yeah.
Then they had the merry-go-round that we played on. And you got to play with a number of kids who didn't live in the area, especially what we used to say, the kids from across town. You know, one of the other things that kind of stick out was the annual trip to the train station where we were taken, and then the trip to the fire station at that time for a visit. And the fireman would ask some of us kids if we wanted to slide down the pole. Yeah.
Okay.
So that was, you know, kind of enlightening to share some of the resources of the community. And when we came back to school, we had to either draw a picture or write a little report about that and hand it in to Ms. Biggs.
Yeah. Okay. When you were outside playing, were you ever aware of like smoke from the factory or anything like that?
Of course, where we lived on Cover Street, and the Gale was right across the street. So we always saw the smoke. We always smelled the fumes. The ladies in the Cover Street, Gale Street, Gas and Court area only washed on certain days, you know, because of the soot. But yeah, we were constantly aware of the smoke and the smells. But it was life, you know.
Oh yeah.
We didn't think anything of it at that particular time period.
In addition to a group like Safety Patrol, and I realize you were only in kindergarten, first grade, were you aware of any other kind of school organizations at West Ward?
No, wasn't aware of any organizations other than Safety Patrol. But one highlight was that somehow Miss Biggs took a number of us to Jackson, to the old roundhouse. And after we kind of viewed the roundhouse from the outside, then we went to one of her friends' house who lived in Jackson at that time and had kind of like a little repast where we sit down and we talked about our experience, and we had light snack, which was something entirely different for that time period.
Yeah, yeah. In school, what do you remember about lunch? Did you eat lunch in school? Did you go home for lunch?
We went home every day.
Okay.
We went home every day. You know, we'd walk that. It was approximately about 2 blocks. It was maybe a block and a half, but and we just went home every day for lunch.
Okay.
And then walked back. That's the reason my younger brother followed us to school that day, is because we had went home for lunch and came back, and he was outside playing, and he just followed myself and my older sister to school.
Okay. Do you ever remember getting any kind of snacks like nutrition break or juice, anything like that as a part of school?
We might have had milk, you know, the customary milk thing where you paid a nickel or something like that, but I don't remember any snack.
Okay. In the building, in terms of atmosphere, how do you remember it? What, was it gloomy and dark, bright, cheerful, comfortable? How did you remember Westmore?
I always thought it was just school. I didn't think it was being gloomy or doom, because most of the time you were having a nice time with your friends and your teacher, and then you kind of always looked up to the older classmen who were much older than you, sharing the bathroom or talking outside the school or playing in the bushes right beside the front door when you came up that walkway.
Yeah.
I guess I never thought of it as being a gloom and doom situation.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned, when we talk about recess, you mentioned the trees. Do you recall when you went out the front door towards Dalrymple Street and the swings were on the left? Do you remember the trees that were right outside?
That row of trees?
Yeah, it was a row of trees. Oh, do you remember in the fall that a lot of them had golden, yellow leaves and everything? Do you remember?
Yeah, well, that was one of our activities. Go outside, get the leaves, bring them back in, trace around them, and you had a lot of fun playing out there in that area.
Yeah.
One of the lessons I learned the hard way was when it started to get cold, my mother took my older sister Barbara and I to Penny's Black Gloves, and she bought Barbara some mittens, and I don't know if you remember, they had the Roy Rogers gloves with the fringes on them that were cotton, and I wanted some so bad. My mom said, "No, you need to get these other gloves. They're going to be nice and warm." "Mama, I want the Roy Rogers gloves with the fringes."
Yeah.
She said, "Okay, I'm going to get these for you, but I told you beforehand, in the winter and late fall, your hands are going to get cold, and I don't want to hear it."
Yeah.
So I got the Roy Rogers gloves, and some of the time in the winter when my hands would get cold, I thought about what she said, but I knew I had to keep my mouth shut because she said, "I told you so."
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but those are fun times playing on those swings, going out the front door. And we had one guy, he lives in Jackson now, and we always see who could pump the swings. That's the word we used to use back then. Pump the swings as high as they can go and swing, and then bail out.
Right. Yeah. Did you bail out?
I was kind of conservative. I bailed when it was low, but when we got the swings up real high, I was not about to bail out.
Yeah, I do remember that. Speaking of your gloves, do you remember where the cloakroom or the coat room was?
It seemed like it was outside in the hall, if I remember correctly.
By the front door?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you ever go into the basement for anything?
No, I got to, the way I saw the basement, you had to go outside and go down.
Yeah.
And I got to the door and I looked in. But again, Miss Biggs was kind of watching us, and she had told us not to go down there. But being, as a kid, curious, you look in, but
you remember what you saw?
I can't remember what I saw.
Okay. In terms of books and supplies, as adults, I've heard we hear stories about the kind of materials we were getting. As a young student, were you aware that any of the materials you received were not up to standard or anything like that?
No, I really didn't think about it. We were there. Miss Biggs was highly structured. You pretty much did what you were told. If the books and supplies were inferior, just didn't think about it. I think one of the things that probably helped myself and my older sister is that, you knew you're going to go to Bob's Pearson store. You're going to get a tablet. You're going to get a couple pencils. And you're going to get that box of Crayola crayons that had maybe 5 to 10 crayons in it. And the books you just got at school, and you just work with that. And then my mother would work with us at home, kind of reinforcing what we learned in school.
Okay. When it comes to the closing, you are of Westward, you had already gone to another school. Well, you were getting ready to go to another school. Does anything stand out in terms of what kind of discussions you might have heard your parents having about expressing any kind of concern about the school or anything like that?
We knew that they were going to close the school. The big concern in my family was that, where would my sister Barbara and I go? We knew that the kids who had not attended West Warren in that area were going to go to Dalrymple. And it was talked about that we were going to have to go to Austin. And I know my mother got together with a couple of the other ladies in the area, and they were writing a letter and petitioning either school board or superintendent that, especially for my family, that if Carl was going to go to Dalrymple, then both Barbara and I should go to Dalrymple too. And I know there was discussion because some of the parents had said, yeah, we are going to boycott this move. But when it came down to it, I know my mother and another lady wrote a letter, and some of the people who said that they were going to back them kind of bailed out. And so as a result, there were probably on my street, I'm saying it was my sister and I, Lizzie Ashley, Marlene Hall, and on the next street it was probably Judy Thomas and Janet Thomas, and then maybe maybe Belle Foster and Veronica Foster were the only ones that actually boycotted. Other kids in the area went to Austin. We had heard talk about they're going to close the school, and the school was at a disadvantage. We weren't getting what we should have got as elementary kids, but as I look back at it, I don't know if that was really the case.
Yeah.
I thought, because when I got to Dalrymple, I fit right in, and I could do a lot of other things that other students could do at that particular time.
Okay. After the school closed, do you remember it being like a recreation area, especially in the summertime?
Yeah, as being kids, you tend to play ball on the streets. And the people in our area, some of the folks that were beginning to buy nicer cars didn't want us to play in the street. Why don't you take your butt up to the street and play at West Ward on the school ground? So we go up there and play ball all the time. And one of the things was Mrs. Lee had the house on the corner of Cass and Albion Street. And as a youngster playing ball up there, you had arrived as an athlete if you could knock the ball from where the screen was to cross the street to Miss Lee's. And then they had the basketball court that it was dirt, of course, and it had the one backboard, and every now and then somebody would come up with a basketball and we played on that. So yes, it was a strong recreation area for a number of years, even while we were, elementary school, junior high, and then sometimes in the summer, when some of us began to run track at the high school, we'd have relay races where it would be like 4 guys running from corner to corner, and with the handoffs. So we played football up there, and we just used that as a recreation area for years and years. Matter of fact, until I got out of high school, even after that.
Do you, this would have been maybe even after you had moved. Do you remember, we used to call them street dances, where they would set up sound equipment and block off one of the streets in the evening, and somebody from the city would come out and play music? And
That was before my time.
Yeah.
I'm thinking maybe junior high and high school. Joe McCracken, the recreation department, had tennis court dances at the tennis courts, and we'd go there and have dances. But I can remember folks talking about street dances.
Street dances, yeah.
But at that time, Woodrow Sr. wasn't allowing myself and my sister to be a part of that.
Yeah. Okay, so where did your parents come from?
My mother's from Alabama and my father's from Georgia.
You know what area?
Yeah, my mother's from Greenville, Alabama, which a lot of folks from Alabama came from. And my father is from Jeffersonville, Georgia.
Okay, man.
And it was part of that migration where one came and got a job, and then the other one came. Matter of fact, I was not able to travel that much until I finally got out of college. Well, actually grad school in '72, and one of the things I began to do was go to Jeffersonville, Georgia. And once there, I was visiting a great aunt, and she told me how her father was one of the first ones from the Jeffersonville area that came to work at the Malibu. And then my father's uncle came, and then my father's brother came, and then he came.
Okay.
And then my mother's family was pretty much the same thing. My father came to Greenville, met her, and began to write letters to her. He came to Greenville, they got married, she came north, and then her brothers came north to work at the factory, and then later her sister came.
Do you remember about when that occurred, that they came?
My mother came in 40, I'm going to say she came in 43 when her and my father got married. And then my aunt and uncles on the Simpson side came after that. My Uncle Eddie, my father's brother, I think he came, I'm going to say in 38.
Okay.
Because that other great uncle who came and worked at the Malibu, he came, he stayed for about 2 or 3 years, and then he went back to Georgia because Aunt Madge told me when I was talking to her that she was about 3 years old when she finally saw her father, because he came and he worked and he stayed here, and then he came back to Georgia.
Okay. Well, good. Your father was a hunter, right?
Yeah.
And did he ever take you?
Yeah, one of the things I can remember growing up is that he would take my brother Carl and I with him hunting, and he always had a rule. He would be out front, and we had to be so many yards behind him. And a lot of times, we didn't even see the game that he was shooting at, but he had an old single shotgun, and he was a pretty accurate shot.
Yeah.
And he said, go over and pick up the squirrel, or go over and pick up the rabbit, and or the raccoon, and we'd bring it home. And one of my brother and I experiences was to help him clean the game. And back in the 50s, it might have been the David Crockett period, when we finally did get a TV, because we had the biggest family on the block and we were always the last one to get a lot of modern stuff, is that we'd take the squirrel tails and put them on our hat and wear them to school.
Yeah, because he gave me one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that about your dad. Yeah. Well, do you have questions?
So tell us a little bit more about after elementary school and off to Washington Gardner.
Washington Gardner.
And how was that?
Well, by the time I got to Washington Gardner, I was not really interested in school per se. I took the classes I had to take, and school was just something you attended. I can remember having an ideal schedule my 7th grade year, where the last class of the day was gym. I had the academic courses, like the math, the English, and everything, first in the morning, and then in the afternoon, we ended up with like shopping and gym, the last class of the day. But then the next semester, they switched it around, and I had gym and shop and all that stuff first in the morning, then I had the math and the English and all that stuff. And I remember a lady, Waverly Lindsay, who was probably ahead of her time, because in 7th grade math, if you did not do well on her math exams, you were required to come in her room after school, and she gave us additional math help. And that stood out to me. One of the things that stood out to me is before my 7th grade year, the people in junior high had a study hall. They had did away with the study hall, and we went to an SRA type of reading series where it was time reading your story, and then you take exam after you read. And that kind of was good because it helped with the reading. And you had your spelling, which was always pretty good for me. One of the things I developed when I was in elementary schools, I always liked to read history books. So I would half do a lot of my other required stuff just so I could read a lot of the history books at that time. They had little blue books of maybe 150, 200 pages. But I wasn't very motivated academically. One of the things I used to do was I used to skip, when my mother started to work outside at home, I would skip school. And one day, the homeroom teacher caught me. And she sit me down and she gave me a real good talking to about the importance of school. I didn't really listen, but I heard what she said, and that kind of stuck with me. And from the time that I had her until the time that I graduated and until I went on to college, there was a kind of a guessing game with her. Every time I would see her, I would ask her, "Do you know who I am?" And she would tell me. And then much later, it got to the point when I asked her, "Do you know who I am?" She said, "I don't remember your name, but you're one of Lily's kids." But I had a good time in high school. I played sports, which was my major interest. The young ladies were my major interest. I didn't do anything too much academically. I did just enough to get by. I was more interested football, basketball, baseball, track, the party at the VFW on Friday, or when Bobby Wall was talking about he lived at cider mill, and it was named Bennett Hall later.
Oh, that little
Yeah.
place down.
Yeah. So we always had a lot of dances at either the VFW or
Yeah.
Bennett Hall, which was a fun time for all. And I didn't really get serious about school until my last semester, when the college football coaches would come around and talk about, well, we think you can play football in college. But by that time, things had changed greatly. And plus the other thing that happened that was good for me in high school, I started working at the Alabama Iron Company the last part of my senior year. So I was going to school, playing sports, and working a full-time job at that time.
And then what happened after you graduated?
Well, when I knew I was going to graduate and the college football coaches started talking about you can play football at college, there was peer pressure because we had some kids who were going on to school the year before, and parents talked, and with some of the guys who were older than me, they were going to college, and I decided I wanted to go, so I ended up enrolled at Jackson Community College, and going to school was a challenge, not only academically, but financially, because my father had an old car, and when the car broke down, how do you get to school? So I rode the bus, I hitchhiked. There were times I didn't know how I was going to get home at night. But my mother was one of the ones who said it was all in how bad you want it. And so I got through one semester, and then the next semester, I rode the bus back and forth. I would ride the bus to where facilities is in Jackson now. And then in the winter, if I didn't have the money to ride the city bus, I would walk downtown Jackson. And I really questioned myself a number of times of why I was doing that. But, I think there's a plan for all of us. And much later in life, when I talked to my mother about it, she said, well, you set the pattern for your other brothers and sisters, and they saw you going through it. And if you could do it, they could do it. And as a result of that, a number of us went on to college and did a fairly decent job.
Well, I know you ended up as a professor. So after your stint at Jackson Community College, when you were just describing, what were some steps after that when it got you finally to be?
Well, after I began to have some success in the classroom, especially when I wanted to quit, my mother sat me down and said to me that, look, my life is set. You aren't going to school for me. You're going to school. You're going to college for yourself. But before that, I had the personal experience of knowing yours truly, Mr. Wall, because they lived right across the street from us, and I'd watched his struggle and his sister's struggle, and how his mother had persuaded them to go to college, and she would talk to my mother sometime about college and the college experience. And we saw what Bobby and his sister Frances did, and she kind of used that as an example. She said, if you want to do it, you'll do it. And my mother told me, I don't want to hear you coming to me 15 years later and saying, how come you didn't make me? And so I kind of stuck it out. There was a guy at the college, Jackson Community College, a professor by his name was Rod Biggs. He's the dean of students. When I wanted to quit, and he said, look, you didn't do anything in high school. You didn't take the subject you're supposed to take. All you really want to do is go back to work, get a car, and ride around with who likes a lot of your friends. He just said, delay that gratification for a little while. I listened to him, I listened to the mother, and then there was another lady who ended up being kind of a mentor. Her name was Miss White. Her daughter was my girlfriend in high school for a number of years, and she would always encourage me. Matter of fact, sometime when I'd be riding the bus back to Albion, and I'd have to walk past her house, and she would say, "Woody, come in, sit down, and talk with me." And we talk about school, we talk about the relationship with our daughter since her daughter and I had broke up. And before I get ready to leave to walk that 2 blocks home, she would offer me $1. That's why I can't take your money. Boy, take my money. Stay in school, you know. So after I graduated from JC, my brother was already at Olivet, and so I transferred to Olivet. I stayed there. I got to do my college dream, which I thought was play football for 1 year. We graduated. Then after graduation, I worked 2 jobs. I was a Head Start teacher and child care worker at Star. And while I was doing that, I realized how much I liked school. So after working 2 jobs for a year, I enrolled at Michigan State to pursue a master's degree. I stayed there and pursued a master's degree and obtained that. Came back to Star as a full-time employee teaching, and I stayed there for about a year, and then I went to Jackson Community College as kind of administrative assistant, and I was out of school for a couple of years, and all the while I realized how I liked school, so I decided to go back and work on another degree, a specialist degree, because I wanted to see how far I could take it, and I had younger brothers and sisters at that time, and my mother was still using me kind of as a guinea pig to speak, to let your brothers and sisters know what they can do, because if they see you do it, they will do it. So I stayed there, and going from administrative assistant to being a counselor for a number of years, and then one of the president had the idea he was going to phase out the counseling service and use faculty advisors, which really didn't work out because of a number of reasons. And so they moved a number of us from the counseling department into the classroom. So I finished, finally get to use my history major as a classroom history instructor before I retired. So when I think back educationally, I thank Ms. Biggs for being very, very important. I thank Wes Ward, Ms. Holmes, Ms. Ferguson, Ms. Biggs, Ms. Stewart were the people that I saw early, and little did I know they'd have a great impression on my life. Along with, you know, a lot of instructors I had in elementary school, high school, Jackson Community College, you know. I had a good ride.
How were things at Olivet when you were there? Did you have a good time at Olivet?
Olivet was a little different when I went there. It's kind of out in the middle of nowhere. I knew my brother was there. I knew one of his friends was there. But the social climate wasn't there. You know, there were like maybe five or six black girls and maybe 15 or 20 guys. So when I first went there, I came home every weekend, and then I came home on Wednesdays to play basketball in the City League. And I'd always, when I came home, a lot of my friends had cars who were in the service, and we always went back to Jackson, because by being in Jackson Community College, that was where my social circle was, and I knew a lot of young ladies, you know. And while being at Jackson, you know, we had classmates, a number of them who went to Michigan State, So we go to Michigan State for a lot of social experiences also.
What years were you at Michigan State?
I started in the fall of 70, and I graduated in 72.
Wow. We had some overlapping time.
Yeah, we used to meet in the library and I talk occasionally,
Yeah.
because we've been neighbors and I used to work for your mother.
Did you have Harry Reid for an history instructor?
I didn't take any history classes
Okay.
at Michigan State by that time. Well, in 68, 69, teaching was kind of closing for history instructors. So when I got to Michigan State, I said I want to make sure I get a job when I get out. So I was in special ed, emotionally impaired, capitalize on the Star Commonwealth experience.
Yeah.
I'm going to shift back to West Ward and the boycott and the closing, and see if I'm understanding what you said, or let me walk back through our last interview as well. I was saying that the school was actually opened in the fall of '53, but then parents held the kids out. Did some kids go to West Ward for that month and a half before they closed the school, or did the school board shift them to Austin?
School board shifted to Austin.
That's what I'm learning from your conversation. I wanted to make sure.
Because my brother went to kindergarten with the people on Culver Street. He and a guy named Louis Stone, who now lives in Detroit. They were more like brothers than he and I were, and so they went directly to Dalrymple. And my mother said that if Carl's going to Dalrymple, then Barbara and Woody are going to go to. I want them to go to Dalrymple too. And as a result of that, they said no, they have to go to Austin because they had the West Ward experience. And she said no, all of them. She wanted all of us to go to the same place. So we were held out of school for a number of weeks. And initially it was fun because everybody else was going to school. We were still playing. But after a while, we wanted to be in school. We got tired of being at home every day. And if I remember correctly, one of the things that happened, even though we were at home, my mother was making sure that we were getting some activity school-wise. And one of the things she insisted on was that we always came to the library to get books. And as we came to the library to get books, we were pretty much required to get books for our younger brothers and sisters. And so we would be helping them, in essence, in the summer.
Good. I was holding you because I knew I could move that conversation if you didn't say anything. So I was like, that's good.
So we're
That's good.
done?
Well, are there more questions? He covered a lot of territory.
Yeah. No, that's good.
You should write a memoir about your educational journey.
Well, I don't know if that's all that necessary. I'm kind of low-key. I think a lot of the older students that were there before me at West Ward and went on and do things and go off to college, I think they really set the pace, even before financial aid was available, there were students that we knew, even though we didn't realize that we were poor economically, that had went on, did things and went to college. And I'm thinking, if I can remember the people who were in my class that went to West Ward, I think only 2 of us went on to college. And I think that was myself and Celeste Bell, But, Bobby and Floyd were best friends, and Floyd went to Adrian. Where'd you go?
I went to Youngstown when I first left.
Yeah, I knew you went to somewhere. And your sister went somewhere in
She
Ohio.
went to Youngstown too.
Yeah, I knew you. And we'd always heard about your mother telling the neighbors about you folks was getting to school, and I always remember your mother stressing that. And of course, you had Mrs. and Miss Pearson at the store.
Yeah.
They would always talk about going to school, going to college, whether you had the money or not. And then right up the street, you had Mary Lee,
Yeah.
who kind of stressed that. So there were always folks in the area that stress formal education, whether you had the money or not. And in the Cover Street area, we were pretty fortunate because you go up and down the street, you know, on the one side of the street you lived on, you and your sister on the other side of the street, when we lived right across, you know, my sister, myself, my brother, Louis Stone, Sylvia Davis or Sylvia
Yeah.
Lawhorn,
Yeah.
Sylvia's older sister, Lorene, went, and her other sister Brenda to live right next. Now, was that the Pythian Hall that old Louis
Well,
Church?
it was many things. It was a church, then it was Pythian Hall.
Yeah, and so in our area, you know, there were folks up and down the street that took advantage of a lot to offer, you know.
Because when we were coming up, it was made clear, and not just by the people in your home, but in general, it was expected that you were going to go to college some kind of way, but that's what you were supposed to do. And the other two options would either be the Malibu or the military for guys. But it was just expected that those are your options, and the best one is to go to school. And you're right, they never talked about how we were going to do that. That's just what you were supposed to do. And it was reinforced, you know, like you said, you go to the grocery store, wherever, church, we got the same message from many sources.
I think the thing about the churches that was good is that one of the things when you went to, and this is probably just me talking, when you didn't get a chance to shine at Dalrymple when you went to integrated school, as a church, you were expected to do something.
Yeah.
You had to give that speech,
Yeah.
Christmas and Easter. And my mother said, you are not getting up there embarrassing me.
That's right.
You are going to learn this. And, you know, there was a chair of choir. Another thing about Miss Biggs, which was over and above the call of duty, you know, in Macedonia Church, she had the chair of choir. Matter of fact, she was initially started the chair of choir, and my mother was one of the ones, because she could sew good, you had to make those little white gowns. And so she would teach all day, and then she'd have choir practice at our house at the church, and then you were expected to be at church on Sunday to sing, which was a good experience for us. Now, the church experience was different for me because we lived right across the street from the church. So you had to go to Sunday school, you had to go to church, and then you were expected to go to Baptist Training Union in the evening.
Yeah.
And as soon as my mother said you didn't have to go, there was a lot of years I did not go to church.
Yeah.
Until I was grown, came back after I got my master's, and I knew what I was supposed to do. I knew how blessed I had been, and so I started, you know, going back to church because I had drifted away from it, you know. And I think one of the things that was hard for a lot of the older folk is they realized we grew up in church, and they didn't realize we were going to stray, but then they knew we were going to come back, and they were awful glad to see a lot of us come back.
I know you were at the reception for Ruth Holland Scott. What was your interaction with the Holland family?
Well, their brother Rodney, the youngest one, he and I and my brother played football together in high school. And we were at Olivet together also. Matter of fact, all three of us graduated. But the Holland family always kind of stuck out because we knew that they were a family that kind of preached and practiced education, you know. Ruth, I did not know. I knew who she was, but I did not know. But I was around when Bobby went off to college. Billy was in high school. Matter of fact, a lady named Miss Heber used to sit up in homeroom teacher. We'll talk about are there any Jesse Womack's or Billy Hollins in this class who kind of stand out and talk rights. And I watched Billy play football. Bobby went to Union College, Connecticut, New York. Billy went to Michigan State University. And then Mr. Holland, when he would come down to Olivet sometimes, matter of fact, he was the one that kind of put grad school in a lot of our minds, because we were sitting down one time and he was talking about what are you guys going to do after you graduate? And some of us saying no more school. He said, yeah, son, you got to go to grad school. Miss Holland was always talking education. And they were just good people that practiced that and they preached that. And when you look at the overall complex of the area we lived in, if you go back and do a longitudinal study, if you take in Michigan Street, Yale Street, over to Erie, probably, I'm going to say if you start at Pearl Street, from Pearl, Erie, Washington, Michigan, and go all the way back in that part of the city limits, you would be astounded at the number of folks that went on to college.
And did very well.
Did extremely well for themselves. You know, some of them went back when they got out of service, but if you include that area, it's just like a who's who of Albion that went on to get college degrees.
And as we think about the Holland Park story, just that whole neighborhood story is an important element to
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so.
And you did work a little bit in the Malibu. What was your experience there?
The Malibu was a great experience. You learn what you did not want to do for the rest of your life. Because at that time when I went in, they weren't talking 30 and out. First I went in working third shift, and then they switched me to second shift, and you worked from 4 o'clock till the iron ran out. That was good because you could save some money, but it killed your social life. The Malibu experience was good because you could work. I worked in the summers. You could get just about all as much overtime as you wanted. One of the guys, Nathan Dickmeyer, was a friend of my brother Carl, so he got to work at Christmas break. And so if he was working, then a number of other guys could work and college kids could work. So I always worked as much overtime as I could. One of the unique experiences is a lot of the older men had a lot of ownership in the Malibu, and it was their factory. They weren't an employee. It was their factory. And they would tell you, young boy, don't raise the rate when you got a chance to do piecework or incentive work, because you're going to be back in school with the lovelies, and we're going to be here. So keep the rate at a reasonable rate so it doesn't raise too much. But I truly enjoyed the Malibu. You know, I had a lot of great experience. The one challenging thing, though, was that I think a lot of the former athletes really had a hard time, because a lot of the older guys would ride them and tell them, you're going to be just like me. You're going to go right from Washington Gardner High School right down here with us, and this is where you're going to be the rest of your life. This is going to be your future. And that could affect you one way or another. You know, the first night I went to work, you know, a lot of guys pulled me aside and said, no, we don't want you coming down here being like us. We want you to come down here, get some money, and go off to school. Because this shouldn't be your future. This is our future. Some of them have went off to college, and for whatever reason, it didn't work out. They came back, they had a job, got married, and raised their families. But they told a lot of us, you know, this shouldn't be for you, you know. Go ahead and get your education. But I have a lot of fond memories working in the Alabama Iron Company.
Okay,
This was really good.
went really fast.
Oh, thank you so much.
You know, thank you. You know, thank your mother.
Yeah.
Thank your mother, because you know, she was very instrumental in